Tear gas and violence on the first night of the Ferguson curfew. We begin this morning in the immediate wake of an unsettling overnight in Ferguson, Missouri, where a curfew ordered by the governor went into effect at midnight Central Time and was lifted just 2 hours ago. When Missouri Governor Nixon declared a state of emergency in the St. Louis suburb and announced the curfew yesterday afternoon, there were loud cries of protest from many demonstrators who pleaded with Nixon to reconsider. But the curfew went into effect at midnight anyway, and here's what we know happened on the ground in the overnight hours. Just before the curfew took effect, there were hundreds of protesters who had gathered in what was a steady rain last night to peacefully protest the police shooting of an unarmed teenager named Michael Brown 1 week ago Saturday. And when the midnight deadline arrived, many of those protesters heeded the instructions of police to disperse and to head home. But there were other protesters who remained. They marched with their hands up and drove down the street with some people standing on cars chanting things like "hands up, don't shoot, no justice, no curfew," and that they were, quote, never going home. Less than an hour into the curfew, just before 1 a.m. Central Time, police, including 5 armored vehicles, assembled to move in on that crowd.
This is the police department. You are violating the state-imposed curfew. You must continue to disperse peacefully, or you will be subject to arrest and/or other actions.
Police began firing canisters into the crowd that they initially said were smoke and not tear gas. An NBC producer who was on the scene, though, shooting video near the front lines, someone who has been exposed to tear gas before, says that it was, in fact, tear gas. And a few hours later, law enforcement admitted that at least some of the canisters were tear gas.
They deployed tear gas. Well, first they deployed gas, just gas initially, smoke. We call it smoke. So they deployed smoke, several smoke canisters to assist in moving the crowd backwards. They kept moving forward. At the time that the team started moving forward, they continued to deploy smoke.
That was Captain Ron Johnson from the Missouri State Highway Patrol, a Ferguson native who's been running the law enforcement response on the ground since Thursday. He says the police moved in on the protesters not to disperse the crowd, but to control separate incidents that were unfolding in the area. He added that there were 7 arrests overnight. He said a police car was fired upon in the vicinity and that one victim was shot, not by law enforcement, but amid the clashes in the street.
We have a shooting victim that's in critical condition that may lose their life. We had a subject standing in the middle of the road with a handgun. We had a police car shot at tonight. And yes, I think that was a proper response tonight to maintain officer safety and public safety. So we didn't have more victims, whether that was law enforcement or some of our citizens.
All right, the Huffington Post's Ryan Reilly, who has been in Ferguson all week, he joins us live from there this morning. Thanks for taking a few minutes, Ryan. Appreciate it. So can you just take us through what the night was like for you? You were there, you witnessed it, what your vantage point was for this, and what you saw overnight.
Sure, it was an intense night, and the media, essentially most of the media at least, was confined sort of actually to this media area that they set up for the first time last night, which actually was the Ferguson Market, the parking lot of the Ferguson Market, where the alleged robbery took place, and that has been the subject of some protest and looting the previous evening. So we essentially, in this night, as opposed to being on sort of the side, physically on the side of the protesters and being amongst the crowd, we're essentially separated from the crowd and saw this from the police perspective rather than the side of the protesters.
And the protesters, the 7 arrests we're talking about, these are people who were protesting. We're showing some of the scenes on the screen of people walking with their hands up in the air. These are the people who were arrested. Were there any other arrests you were aware of?
Yeah, I think those were the main ones that that he talked about. I'm not sure if I'm aware of any other arrests outside of that. I just note that yesterday, as compared to some of the previous nights, I think especially earlier on in the night, it was a much different. It was a different crowd. I think all the reporters kind of all concluded that this was a little bit different. It was a much younger crowd. There weren't as many adults sort of scattered throughout. There weren't as many people necessarily holding. I guess everyone sort of responsible holding him in line. There were a couple of groups that were trying to maintain order that Captain Johnson was working closely with when we saw earlier on. But this was pretty relatively early on the night. A couple of reporters were sort of commented to by a couple of the protesters that that we could essentially become targets too. If we started pointing our cameras around when I think things got crazy, which was the quote from one of the individuals told us.
Mm-hmm. And so now, if you could describe for us what the scene was like before the curfew was imposed, trying to get the protesters, the police trying to get the protesters to disperse and go home. What was that process like?
Sure. So they're down where we were located, which is the closer to a lot of the businesses that had been targeted last night that we could see from our vantage point. I mean, things were getting pretty clear. There was a group of peacekeepers on the street who were sort of encouraging everyone to go home, and the rain, I think, also was a big crowd deterrent here. It was pouring, completely pouring at some point, so that was certainly something that kept people, that maybe encouraged some people to head home. But the area around the QT, the Quick Trip, which had been burnt down, of course, earlier this week, was where most of the activity was taking place. So it was tough for us as the press to see what was happening down there. And obviously Vice was in there amongst the crowd, but we were not allowed to sort of move down. We were told we would be subject to arrest at that point. So the few reporters had made the decision to sort of ignore that, but it was also difficult to find a way even to get down there that a police officer wouldn't stop you.
You also, so this is before the curfew went into effect. You were tweeting last night. I was following, and you tweeted something that just really jumped out at me. You said that you had witnessed on your Twitter handle. You said, one of the most incredible moments I've ever experienced in my career as a journalist. And what you were tweeting about was you watched an encounter between Captain Johnson and I guess there was a young man wearing a mask who was shouting something at him. We have some pictures of it. Can you talk about what you witnessed? What was so incredible?
Sure. So this was sort of right after an impromptu sort of press conference with Captain Johnson, where he was informing us how he thought the night was going, saying at that time that he thought that things were going pretty well and that people were going home. And after he sort of walked away, an individual walked in. He had a bandana around his face, obviously, and started yelling. It was very, very aggressive and threatening, I think, and certainly intimidating to a lot of the media who was there, and continued to follow the officer. And at one point, a couple of the fellow officers sort of got in front of Johnson, got between Johnson and between this individual to sort of cut him off. And it looked like a very tense situation. There was someone who was accompanying the protester who was trying to calm him down, but he was obviously very riled and heated up. And at one point, Johnson, who had been looking and sort of had been walking away, turned over and walked directly to him. And had one of the most amazing things I've ever seen, this civil exchange between this protester who's very angry about what had happened and how he feels as an African American in this community, and this Ferguson native Johnson, who basically, said that he was right on a lot of things and that he understood how he felt, and talked about the FBI coming in and how important that investigation was, and said at one point that investigation is going to lead them right through Missouri all the way to the White House.
Wow. And quickly, Ryan, just how long do we know how long the curfew is going to last? Is it going to keep going tonight indefinitely? Do we know what the deal is there?
I think all that's sort of up in the air right now. We're not too sure. We haven't really been given any information. I'm sure we'll be finding out, either later this morning or this afternoon, what's going to happen and what's going to be the plan for tonight.
All right, my thanks to Ryan Reilly of the Huffington Post for taking a few minutes from Ferguson. Really appreciate that. We have quite a panel here. We have Michael Steele, we have Bob Herbert, we have Basil Smykel. We are going to hear from all of them when we come back from a break.